Honorable Prime Minister Dr Manmohan Singh ji, Srimati Gusharan Kaur ji, Dr Subbarao, Professor Raghuram Rajan, Shri T N Ninan, Mr Manzan Khan, authors and contributors to this festschrift volume, ministers, members of parliament, representatives of the think tank community, private sector, civil society, and the media. I offer a very warm welcome to all of you on behalf of ICRIER and OUP. This is a very special occasion when we felicitate our Prime Minister on the release of the second and updated edition of the book, India's Economic Reforms and Development, Essays for Manmohan Singh, as an Oxford India Perennial. As many of you know, this book was first published in 1998, a year or so after Dr. Manmohan Singh laid down office as Finance Minister. At that time, he had successfully steered India away from a major economic crisis and put the economy firmly on the path of faster growth, which would make easier the task of inclusion, poverty alleviation, and improvement in the standards of living of our people. None of us thought that he will get an opportunity again to play a major role in shaping India's economic and social future. Some of us thought that we should celebrate his contribution to India's economic development by producing a festschrift. I approached Professor IMD Little, who was Dr. Singh's thesis advisor for his PhD thesis at Oxford in the early 1960s. Professor Little was very enthusiastic about this project for his most distinguished student. We approached 15 economists who knew Dr. Manmohan Singh and who were actively engaged in following the course of India's economic and social development. All of them readily agreed to write on different aspects of India's economic reforms and development. The book was released by then Prime Minister Shri Inder Kumar Gujral in December 1997. 4 months ago, I received a call from Mr. Manzan Khan, Managing Director of Oxford University Press in India. He told me that our book has been selected by OUP as one of 4 Oxford India Perennials, a new series launched on the occasion of celebrating OUP's 100th anniversary in India. The book would therefore be printed in a second edition. I seized the opportunity offered by OUP to reach out to the authors to check if they would be willing to revisit their contribution on the Indian economy and provide us with short postscripts. To my delight, most of them readily agreed, despite their extremely busy schedule, and kept their promise. Professor Vigyan Little and I have written an epilogue which provides our retrospective overview of the past decade and a half since the book was first published. The result is the volume that we present to Dr. Manmohan Singh today. 3 of our 15 authors, Dr. Raja Chelliah, Professor Amaresh Bagchi, and Professor Suresh Tendulkar, have passed away in the 14 years that have gone by. Professor Amartya Sen, Professor Jagdish Bhagwati, Dr. Rangarajan, and Professor T N Srinivasan are not able to join us on this occasion. I would like to announce the name of the 8 authors who are here and would urge you to join me in giving them a hand when I'm through. Lord Meghnath Desai, Shri Montek Singh Ahluwalia, Dr. Ashok Gulati, Professor Vijay Joshi, Professor Ajit Singh, Professor Deepak Lal, Dr. Kirit Parekh, and Dr. V.A. Pai Panandikar. There is one more matter relating to this book that I would like to share with you. From the royalty payments we received from the sales of the book, Dr Manmohan Singh Trust was formed, and the trust has been funding 2 scholarships for the 2 best students of MA Economics at the Delhi School of Economics since 1998-99. The fellows are selected by the Delhi School faculty at the same time that they make selections for scholars for the All India Merit Scholarship and the Delhi School Merit Scholarships. The only time we accepted a supplementary contribution to the fund was in 2002 from Mr. Narayan Murthy, so that we could raise our scholarship to avoid being overtaken by a larger scholarship being offered to the Delhi School of Economics by a multinational company. As it turned out, the multinational company discontinued its scholarship after a year, and another such company did the same after giving a scholarship for 3 years. I am happy to say that the Manmohan Singh Fellowship has continued and remains the highest scholarship at the Delhi School of Economics. We are now able to provide rupees 5,000 per month to each scholar. In addition, OUP provides an allowance of rupees 7,500 per year per fellow for books published by OUP. I am also happy to report that our students received their first check for the quarter within 3 days of learning that they have been selected. So far, over 25 students have received the scholarships, and some of the Manmohan Singh Fellows are present in the hall today. Will the Manmohan Singh Fellows please stand up and take an applause? Thank you. Thank you. We have a very distinguished panel here to speak on the challenges of economic reform in India at the present juncture. I would just like to highlight some facts and some major challenges for the reform process going forward. When the book was first published in 1998, the Indian economy recorded an average growth rate of about 5.5% per annum in the 6 years after the launch of economic reforms in 1991. Today, the growth rate of the Indian economy is over 8% per annum if we look at the past 6 years. In other words, growth has been a good 2.5 percentage points higher even when we faced an adverse external environment in the global slowdown. But the 2.5% faster growth doesn't feel so much better because aspirations have grown faster and we need to make the growth more inclusive. I was thinking when I was going to be speaking here, and what I say now came out of a little bit of reflection on who will be my audience. Indians born in 1991 are 21 years old in 2012. Half of India's population today is below the age of 25. This half of our population started life in India with 5.5% growth, which accelerated slowly and steadily to 8% as they grew up. They are restive for more, not less. No wonder a 7% growth is seen as a collapse. Turning to poverty, the picture is one of improvement and at a faster pace, but that is not enough. During the period from 1993-94 to 2004-2005, the percentage of population in poverty declined at the rate of 0.75 percentage points per year. In the subsequent period from 2004-05 to 2009-10, the decline has been twice as fast. This decline is established no matter where we draw the poverty line. However, given the large magnitude of the problem of poverty which remains with us, this improvement should certainly not lull us into complacency. Of course, with faster growth and rising aspirations, the acceptable level of poverty must be redefined. At the same time, we must accept the fact that faster growth has been associated with faster decline in poverty, and faster growth is necessary for winning our battle against poverty. Faster growth has made it possible at long last to begin to address the challenges of inclusion, social protection, education, and health. The danger today is that we seem to take faster growth for granted. But growth is currently under threat from a deteriorating macroeconomic environment and a downturn in the investment climate. If growth slows down, we will lose instruments that enable us to bring about inclusion, provide social protection, and help eliminate hunger and malnutrition. In writing a retrospective of the past decade and a half for the new edition, it became very clear to us that we face some new challenges to the growth process itself. These include fiscal unsustainability, incomplete financial sector reforms, problems in infrastructure reforms, including those relating to regulatory frameworks, macroeconomic management in an uncertain international economic environment, and also challenges of overall governance. Our authors have covered these issues from different perspectives. Also, I'm sure our distinguished panelists will go over these issues. I would only like to highlight two new challenges that I see emerging. The first is the challenge of urbanization. This was one issue which was not on the agenda in 1998. I had the privilege of chairing a committee on urban infrastructure and service delivery for the Government of India. Our urban population has increased from 286 million in 2001 to 377 million in 2011. Even so, only 30% of Indian population is urban, much less than in most other developing countries, including China. It is projected to increase to 600 million by 2031. The Jawaharlal Nehru National Urban Renewal Mission, popularly known as JNNURM, was a pioneering national mission for the urban sector. Its lessons must be incorporated in the design of the new JNNURM, which should begin soon and be implemented in the spirit of implementing the 74th Constitutional Amendment, which has placed this responsibility on the local governments. Increasingly, more and more cities will have to become the engines of national development. In order to foster the economies of agglomeration and minimize the diseconomies of congestion, we will have to bridge the deficit in urban infrastructure, find ways of financing new investments, improve governance within a decentralized framework so as to significantly improve the state of urban service delivery for all, plan our cities with focus on public transport and affordable housing so as to make them slum-free, and develop capacities to bring all this about. India cannot afford to get its urban strategy wrong. To get it right, it is extremely important to bring about a fundamental shift in the mindset which separates rural from the urban. On the second new challenge, the second major new challenge, it is worth noting again that in 1998, nobody was talking of skill deficit. it took only 10 to 12 years of growth at 7.5% to 8% per annum to show how unprepared we were with respect to the demand for skilled manpower. The challenge is to convert our much talked about demographic opportunity of a growing proportion of working age population into a growth dividend by empowering our youth with the skills that are in demand. Finally, I would like to say that when any society is going through structural transformation associated with rapid growth of the kind that the Indian economy has experienced in the last 20 years, institutions take time to adjust. The process of turbulence is there for all to see in an open democratic society such as ours. It is often termed as collapse of governance. But the strength of a democratic system with its checks and balances is that we must strive for institutional reform within an open and transparent framework. A significant achievement of the economic reforms launched by Dr. Manmohan Singh in 1991 is that 20 years later, many apprehensions have been allayed as India's transformation from a slow-growing economy to one of the fastest-growing economies in the world has been achieved. While we, argumentative Indians, discuss and debate the means to attain and sustain high growth, inclusion has emerged as a central concern. Democratic forces are at work to ensure inclusion in the process of development. As I said earlier, aspirations are rising and the young population is on the move. I have full confidence that we shall overcome. So thank you very much. And with these words, I now present a copy of the book to Dr. Manmohan Singh, after which we will start our panel discussion. We had an agreement with the Prime Minister that he is here to listen and not to speak. So he has said thank you. And now we start our panel discussion, and we really hope he listens. So Professor Raghuram Rajan first.
Thank you very much, Honorable Prime Minister, my fellow panelists, and distinguished guests. It is really an honor here to be here to celebrate the reforms that India undertook in the 1990s, especially the central role of the Finance Minister and now Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh. By reducing controls and increasing competition and entry, those reforms unleashed the latent talents and suppressed energy of our people, and obviously these many years of growth reflect that. So India has a lot to celebrate. It has achieved so much in the 2.25 decades since those reforms. We have, I think, finally and definitely moved away from the Hindu rate of growth of 3.5%. But we also moved, as Isher said, many millions of Indians out of debilitating poverty into a life of some comfort. And yes, that is a fact, despite all the furor over the Planning Commission's numbers. Shops are full of goods that we could only dream of buying in 1990. Many of them are made in India. I can withdraw money today from my US bank account from any ATM around here, and I don't incur the fees that I would incur in the United States. A migrant worker today can send money using his cell phone to his family's bank account in his village. We can buy air and train tickets online. This has eliminated long waits and some corruption in those areas. Organizations like Shankar Nethralaya are showing the world how to offer medical care cheaply and effectively. In short, the consumer in India has never had more choice in the past. And even though we lament the deterioration in our old institutions, we have superb new ones that have taken their place, such as the National Stock Exchange or 24/7 TV networks. The latter's competition for news does keep our administrators on their toes, even though some in the audience may feel that the networks often produce more sound than light. As Mr. Chidambaram and Mr. Yashwant Sinha built on Dr. Manmohan Singh's reforms in the years after this book's first edition was published, we enjoyed perhaps the strongest period of growth India has ever had. Even in our gloom today over the fall in growth to between 6 and 7%, we must understand it reflects how far we have come. 20 years ago, we would have been elated with such performance. So we have come to expect this rate of growth, and as Isher said, it's almost a necessity at this point. However, we cannot be complacent. We have to see that the world is becoming more competitive, and the dimming of India's star in the last few months as our governance is besmirched by corruption scandals and as our macroeconomic health has deteriorated needs to be examined. Certainly, alarm bells should sound when domestic industry no longer wants to invest in India, even while eagerly investing abroad. So we must ask, why the gloom? The problem that I'm sure is obvious to this audience is despite the tremendous success of the first generation of reforms, some of the key next generation reforms have been stymied. Typically, these are the reforms that reduce rents and patronage while increasing competition. For example, bills on foreign entry into higher education, attempts to auction resources transparently, or even attempts to transform public sector enterprises into more autonomous corporations. On the other hand, in recent years, patronage enhancing, rent enhancing, or entitlement enhancing measures have had an easier time going through Parliament. Clearly, there are many exceptions to this asymmetric reform process. The Right to Information Act, for example, and the setting up of the Unique ID Authority of India have been important game changers of the right kind. But I'm talking about a central tendency. So for a while, the growth pushed by the momentum from past reforms papered over the paralysis in growth-enhancing reforms, while it made the expansion in subsidies and entitlements easily affordable. With growth slowing, government tax revenues stagnant as a fraction of GDP and spending high, fiscal deficits remain very high. At the same time, private consumption, especially in rural areas, is growing strongly on the back of rising incomes, strong credit growth, and continuing government transfers and subsidies. The result is that the gap between our spending and our saving is making us dependent on short-term foreign inflows to a dangerously high extent, at a time when the international investor is increasingly skeptical about the India story. Depreciating rupee, I should say volatile rupee, is the first warning sign of an unstable macroeconomy. Rising long-term interest rates could be the second. Dangerously volatile oil prices could lead to a blowout in our fiscal and current account deficits, while at the same time depressing our exchange rate and elevating interest rates. Given geopolitical uncertainties, we cannot afford to be complacent. Now, for a large, vibrant economy like India's, there is always hope. We have the tools to tackle our problems, but we must exercise these tools with vigor and a sense of urgency. I know that sense of urgency is shared within the government, but urgency has to translate into persuasion and action. We need a common minimum program across all sensible political parties to ensure that we stabilize the economy and foreign investor perceptions quickly. Now, if politics and narrow personal advantage trumps economics and national interest, as it has done for the last few years, we will jeopardize the legacy of Dr. Manmohan Singh's reforms that are so well documented in the book. Now, how have we come to this pass? Now, as an academic, and I'm taking license of being an academic, I will offer a possible narrative without any claim that this is tested by evidence. It is at best a working hypothesis, but as I'll argue, it does offer us a scope for action. And my hypothesis is as follows. While Dr. Manmohan Singh's reforms opened up the economy and brought competition in a number of areas, freeing us up to grow, they were incomplete in 4 important respects. First, they left untouched a number of areas such as higher education, where the license permit Raj continued and significant rent-seeking persisted. Second, they left the public sector occupying the commanding heights, even possessing a virtual monopoly in some areas such as coal. Third, they did not recognize the importance of national resources such as land, spectrum, and commodities, and left their allocation ill-defined. And fourth, despite the undoubted success of these reforms, they did not change the public mindset as much as they might have. Now, I want to say all this is to a large extent understandable. One could not do everything at one go, so the reforms had to be prioritized, and the ones that were undertaken were the right ones. Moreover, the need to undertake some of these second-generation reforms became apparent only because of the growth of the generated by the first generation of reforms. And this is a point that Isher made earlier. For example, the public hunger for education and the rents from run-in capitation fee colleges became obvious only after the dramatic increases in growth and the demand for skilled workers after the reforms. Similarly, the patronage from controlling the public sector, as well as the attractiveness of using it for public policy, increased rapidly after reforms as the private sector became less controllable. And commodities have become valuable only after rapid Chinese growth in the last 10 years. I was in Orissa recently, and they told me iron ore was something that nobody even bothered about in the early 2000s. It's only after Chinese growth that it's become so important. And finally, because many of the reforms were gradual, this is the first generation reforms, because they were gradual, in order not to awaken the opposition of vested interests, they were not publicized. But reform by stealth, by its very nature, does not win hearts and minds. Moreover, because the significant fruits of those reforms took time to come, people did not associate them back to those reforms themselves. And in a sense, the public could not see the link. Public mindsets, therefore, moved only a little, especially in their attitudes towards competition and the private sector. I doubt very much that our carpenter attributes his cheap cell phone and his speedy, state-of-the-art two-wheeler to the competition that was brought about by the reforms Dr. Manmohan Singh introduced. So, in a sense, because of the incompleteness of these reforms, we have problems today, and I want to argue that more carefully. By the early 2000s, we were ready for that second generation of reforms, as Isher has pointed out. But powerful elements of the political class, which had never been fully convinced about giving up the rents from the licensed Raj in the first place, then started forming an unholy coalition with aggressive business, whom I shall refer to simply as the connected. What has ensued is coalition adharma, a coalition of the unholy, so to speak. The new post-license permit Raj equilibrium, to some extent, became the resource Raj equilibrium. The resource Raj has resulted in massive fortunes generated by the connected and by some politicians. Now, this is not to take away from genuine politicians who want national progress, as well as the genuine, innovative, and strong businesses that there are many examples of. Many industries became extremely competitive and innovative, including telecom, which is the focus of some investigation today. Dr. Manmohan Singh's reforms, don't get me wrong, have made India enormously better off. But if we want to understand why there's a sense of pessimism today, we have to acknowledge that the full intent of those reforms, to liberalize so as to enhance entry, to increase competition and efficiency, to move us from a producer bias to a consumer bias, and to price and allocate natural resources and opportunities fairly, have not been realized in full measure in some areas of the economy. So, in a sense, the second generation of reforms are ready and packaged in the form of many bills that are waiting to be passed. But these bills, some of them conceived in Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee's government, are stuck, not just because the government does not have the votes to pass them, but because there's not enough political will, even in the ruling coalition, to move on them. Now, what has made the bottlenecks particularly onerous in unreformed areas today is the middle class has grown larger, has become more aware, partly because of legislation like the Right to Information Act brought in by the UPA government, And newly assertive middle-class institutions such as the press, the Comptroller and Auditor General, and the judiciary have started uncovering the massive nexus between the connected and the politicians and the bureaucrats that built up during the go-go years. Unlike in the past, middle-class anger now has tools with which to assert itself, even if the middle class is still a numerical minority in the electorate. So under this scrutiny, the non-transparent systems to acquire and allocate land, iron ore, and other commodities have ground to a halt, so business and investment in these areas is threatened. I pointed out that we have not established public support for the basic principles of competition and free enterprise. Indeed, distrust of even the legitimate activities of the private sector has grown as a result of the scandals that have emerged. Not surprisingly, the utopia promised by the extreme left is once again undergoing a resurgence of popularity. And unfortunately, we haven't fully abandoned our faith in the kinds of methods we used in the past, despite the fact that the dismantling of those methods by the first generation of reforms produced so much. Even in the bills that we have devised that are before Parliament, we don't draw fully on those lessons. For example, necessary remedial schemes, such as the proposed land acquisition bill, I think, even though idealistic in conception, would benefit tremendously from a better focus on incentives as well as less dependence on government capacity. We need to ensure that the lessons from the first generation of reforms are brought in to some of the plans for the second generation of reforms. So to summarize and then move to conclusion, this is sort of the dangerous place we are at. Growth is slowing in part because of bottlenecks. At the same time, given public dissatisfaction, politicians are even more focused on subsidies and transfers to keep people happy, especially as the general elections near. No one wants to be blamed for taking away the goodies, even as our ability to pay for them has plummeted. Politicians are loath to act quickly to give up their rents, so reforms that might improve sentiment are hard to enact. And opposition to liberalization is gathering strength amongst the angry middle class. They've become more willing to listen to old discredited remedies once again because their trust in the private sector has been shattered. But of course, we cannot, should not, must not succumb to pessimism. There's no reason why we cannot regain double-digit growth. Simply moving our millions from low productivity agriculture to rural industry or services will give us growth for many years to come, provided we're willing to do the minimum necessary to collect the low-hanging fruit. And that requires completing the second generation of reforms. We need to liberalize sectors like education, retail, and the press, freeing entry and improving customer choice. We need to transform government-owned firms, more of them, into well-managed, publicly owned firms which are free from political influence or government support. And we need to evolve transparent means of pricing and allocating the bountiful natural resources in our country. Clearly, we also need to ensure that growth reaches more people. We need to reduce levels of inequality. But there's no better way of inclusion than a decent job, no doubt augmented by better public services as well as conditional cash transfers to the poor. And I'm hopeful that as our increasingly difficult situation focuses political minds, we will do what is necessary. So my hope lies in the fact that given that the public is no longer willing to tolerate the actions of the past, perhaps politicians will come together to see that they have no alternative but to change. Moreover, and perhaps as important, businesses themselves, especially the connected ones, are themselves frustrated with the free-for-all resource grab and government paralysis. They do want change. When everyone wants change, perhaps change might actually occur. So let me conclude finally with what I think are short-term steps that we must take. They're nothing that the government doesn't know that it has to do, but I want to emphasize them once again. We need to raise fuel prices quickly to a level that is commensurate with international levels, and then completely deregulate them. We need to do this as soon as possible so that we build confidence that our fiscal is not going to be shattered by some shock to oil prices. Second, we need to resolve the commodity bottleneck in a way that does not give a windfall or a bailout to any party, but ensures that these projects or plants can resume production so that they don't stand as a bottleneck in the economy. If necessary, we should write down the equity of promoters before restructuring bank liabilities. And third, I know this is not necessarily popular, but we have to be kinder to foreign investors. They're not the enemy, but a necessity in these times. We need their money to fund our spending to the tune of 4% of GDP. That is an alarmingly large number. No doubt, however badly we treat them, they will eventually want to be part of the India story. But crises are always about timing. We need them now, when India looks increasingly tattered compared to alternative investment opportunities, not 5 years or 10 years from now. So we should open up to more FDI, where feasible, because FDI is a safer form of financing. We should bring certainty to taxation to foreign investors and resist the temptation to level additional retrospective claims. If we think Mauritius and Singapore offer undue arbitrage opportunities, and I do think they do, we should renegotiate those treaties with prospective effect. Yes, there will be one-time adverse effects, but so be it. And finally, we should avoid the tremendous uncertainty created by catch-all measures such as GAR, which give tax authorities unbridled power. We should focus instead on clearly delineating specific actions that we want to prevent and making them clear to all. I have been very frank. As an academic, that's the only value I bring. So I want to leave with a note of caution. The history of development is full of countries that grew strongly for a while, only to stutter and stop, as the leaders and the people started taking growth as their birthright. Somewhat paradoxically, it's only when we are paranoid about sustaining growth that we will continue achieving it. We need to become paranoid again, as we were in the early 1990s, and perhaps then we will achieve the full promise of Dr. Manmohan Singh's reforms. Thank you.
Thank you, Raghu. May I now invite Dr. Subbarao, Governor, Reserve Bank, to speak.
Honorable Prime Minister, Dr. Mrs. Ahluwalia, Sri Manja Khan, my fellow panelists Raghuram Rajan, Sri Ninan, all my friends and well-wishers. History tells us that modern democracies have really had the good fortune of coming close to the Platonic ideal of being led by a philosopher king. Also, we know that economics draws its origins from moral philosophy. Indeed, Adam Smith was a moral philosopher. Yet few economists since Smith have been recognized as philosophers. We are singularly privileged that we have in our Prime Minister today a philosopher king in the Platonic mold. Also consider this: how many heads of government in the world today have a festschrift written in their honor, celebrating their professional accomplishments with contributions from peers and students? Speaking at this festschrift to honor Prime Minister is a very special occasion for me, something to which I attach enormous value. Those of you who've had exposure to the history of science would know that Sir Isaac Newton was a very arrogant man. When his friend and rival, Robert Hooke, wrote to him lauding his theory of gravity, Newton, for all his arrogance, wrote back with uncharacteristic humility. And this is what he said: "If I've been able to see a little farther than others, it's because I'm standing on the shoulders of giants." That's a statement I can relate to. As the Governor of the Reserve Bank in these exciting times, I owe an intellectual debt of gratitude to the extraordinary men who led the Reserve Bank through several challenges. In that galaxy, the most distinguished is Dr. Manmohan Singh. I'm privileged and proud to be in the same lineage. Also, I was a junior officer in the Ministry of Finance when Dr. Manmohan Singh came in as the Finance Minister. My tribute to the Prime Minister, therefore, is both personal and professional. Standing in front of all of you today, I'm bewildered, also humbled. Frankly, I also feel a bit foolish. However, I'm reminded of what the Prime Minister said in another context on another occasion. When he thought he himself did something presumptuous, Raul Prebisch told him, in life, it's sometimes wise to be foolish. I've been quite foolish in accepting this commitment to speak here. The wisdom of doing so is not yet clear to me. I hope, sir, you will understand this temptation on my part to be foolish and indulge in me, even if I may have been unwise. Since this festschrift is also a celebration of our reforms, of India emerging on the global scene, what I thought I would do is to raise a few questions straddling 1991 and 2012 in order to understand how far we've traversed and also to highlight some of our current concerns. The first question I want to raise is why 2012 is not 1991. A few people are actually beginning to ask this question, the converse of this question, that is 2012, 1991 all over again. What's the basis for this question? We know in 1991 we had a balance of payments crisis, which in turn was a consequence of the fiscal profligacy of the 80s. So the twin deficits are here once again. Large fiscal and current account deficits are lead indicators of stresses building up in the system. So the question is it just a matter of time before we have another implosion? Before I answer that question, let's do a quick comparison of some macro indicators between 91 and 2012. We had fiscal deficit of 7% in 1991. Last year, fiscal deficit was 5.9%. Current account deficit in 91 was 3% of GDP. Last year, the estimate is that the current account deficit is going to be much higher than that. Short-term debt to total debt, which was 10% in 91, is over 20% today. That's quite a disturbing picture. Nevertheless, I will still argue that in 1991, an implosion was imminent. In 2012, an implosion is not imminent. Why? Let me give you some arguments. Most importantly, the structure of the economy has changed in fundamental ways. Our financial markets are more mature, more diverse, and much deeper. They have the resilience to absorb shocks. Our regulatory systems and our crisis response mechanisms are more robust and more sophisticated. The services sector that dominates today, in 1991, it was less than 50%. Today, it's over 65%. And performance of the services sector is less variable than agriculture and industry, and therefore a source of resilience. Yes, fiscal deficit is high today. Indeed, the fiscal deficit budgeted for 2012-13 is also high. But we must also recognize that not all of that is structural. There is at least some cyclical component in that. We had a crisis, there was a fiscal stimulus, our growth had gone down, therefore revenues had gone down, we had to borrow more. So I would argue that as much as fiscal deficit is a concern, we have to recognize that the structural component is less than we realize. Current account deficit is high, but that again is because of certain international factors, certain domestic factors. Imports of gold are high because of the inflation scenario. Gold is a safe haven. It's hedged against inflation. It's a store of value. Therefore, people are buying more gold. But over time, as the external situation improves, as the domestic situation improves, as inflation comes down, I believe this appetite for gold will come down. And therefore, the pressure on the current account deficit will be less than what we realize. Foreign exchange reserves are much larger today, both in terms of the months of import cover and as a proportion of external debt. Just to give you some idea of what that is, in 1991, our external debt was 1,400% of our reserves. Today, our external debt is about 115% of our reserves, so it's quite small in comparison. For all of the above reasons, I believe that in 2012, we're unlikely to see an implosion. I want to emphasize that I'm making only a limited point, which is that the probability of an implosion is low. I'm not saying that we have insulated ourselves from all crises for all times. I'm not saying that the economy is in the pink of health or is on a roll. I'm not saying that today's macroeconomic situation is not a cause for concern. On the contrary, there are serious concerns about the macroeconomy, about our policy environment, and about our governance. Far from being complacent, we should be agitated about the current state of the economy and about its prospects under a business-as-usual case. A lot of people say that despite all this, the India growth story is still intact. I believe it is intact. But we can't ride on the India growth story. There is nothing inevitable about the India growth story unless we keep it going. I don't think there are foreigners waiting forever to get the promise of the India growth story. So we should prove to the world that the current downturn is just a short-term phenomenon and that the long-term growth drivers will come back into play. So, as I leave this question, I want to emphasize once again that 2012 is not 1991. The second question I want to raise is something that people often ask me. Have we been too timid on external sector liberalization? External sector liberalization has been the most dramatic and arguably the most significant part of our economic reforms. Indeed, our external reforms on Dr. Manmohan Singh's watch were the main motivation, I believe, for this festschrift. Before 1991, India was one of the most closed economies in the world. Today, we are much more integrated than we tend to acknowledge. 35 years ago, when I first went abroad, you could just take $20 out of the country. Today, every resident of India can take out $200,000 every year. Since 1991, we've shifted from an administered exchange rate to a market-determined exchange rate. A lot of people don't believe me, but we have. The rupee is convertible on the current account, has been so since 1994. There's been sharp reduction in tariffs. QRs are no longer there. Export incentives have been phased out. We have deeper, more vibrant forex markets and a host of derivative products. The criticism has been that after the burst of reforms in the 1990s, we've developed cold feet and have not moved further. I believe a more nuanced appreciation is necessary. What's been our policy on the external sector? Our policy on the external sector can best be understood in terms of the impossible trinity, which says that a country cannot simultaneously have fixed exchange rate, an open capital account, and an independent monetary policy. Advanced economies, as we know, they give up on the fixed exchange rate. Their exchange rates are fully floating, so that they have open capital accounts and independent monetary policy. Switzerland, an advanced economy, had given up on a flexible exchange rate. They had declared their commitment to defend an exchange rate, and therefore they have forfeited some monetary policy independence. What about India? Where do we stand on the impossible trinity? We looked up the books. Since neither Keynes nor Milton Friedman had pronounced on that, we turned to the son of the soil, Gautam Buddha, and we followed the middle path. So, what's our middle solution? Our middle solution is the following. We let our exchange rate be largely market determined, but intervene in the market to smooth excess volatility or to prevent disruption to macroeconomic stability. Our capital account is only partly open. While foreigners enjoy almost unfettered access to our equity markets, our debt markets are restricted. There are limits to how much resident corporates and individuals can take out for investment abroad, but those limits are quite liberal. Because of the liberalization on the exchange rate and capital account fronts, we may forfeit some independence on monetary policy. So what the middle solution implies is that we have to guard on all the three fronts, with relative emphasis shifting depending on the macroeconomic situation. Those who contend that we've been too timid cite two somewhat interrelated arguments. First, they say that we must move more rapidly and more decisively towards capital account opening. Why? Standard arguments that will give us access to foreign savings, reduce the cost of resources in the economy, it will make our economy more efficient, more dynamic, more competitive, it will deepen our financial markets, it will enforce macroeconomic discipline. The second strand of the argument is that we must let our exchange rate fully float, and that RBI should completely forswear from intervention, no matter what the circumstances. The argument is that then the exchange rate will act as an equilibrating force, and that the Reserve Bank's monetary policy will become more effective. I know that's an extreme case. Very few people make that argument, but I'm citing that just to provide a point of departure for argumentation. I would argue that there is no evidence from around the world that capital account convertibility has been a positive force, regardless of macroeconomic circumstances. On the contrary, there is any amount of evidence to show that premature capital account liberalization can create macroeconomic imbalances with huge costs to growth and welfare. We have the southern cone countries of Latin America, the Asian countries which went into a crisis in the 1990s. We have Mexico, Argentina, Turkey, and the most recent global financial crisis when all the countries which liberalized too fast, too much, came under stress. In fact, all the historical evidence shows that premature capital account liberalization can turn our economy into a high beta economy, making us vulnerable to volatile external cycles, sharp fluctuation in exchange rate, and asset price buildup. In fact, the recent crisis has delivered several lessons, and one of the most decisive lessons is a change in the worldview on capital account. Before the crisis, the IMF orthodoxy used to be that capital controls are inadvisable, always and everywhere. After the crisis, in February 2010, the IMF put out a paper where they said, there are circumstances in which capital controls can be a legitimate component of the policy response to surges in capital flows. The World Bank and the ADB have also said so. Those of you who've read The Economist 2 weeks ago, Economist, the most pro-market magazine 2 weeks ago, was having an article on Turkey. And they pronounced that Turkey was too hasty in opening up its capital account. One of the main G20 initiatives today is actually to define the circumstances under which countries can intervene in their capital account, and also define the path along which countries can approach capital account convertibility. So what's our policy going forward? Our policy going forward is that we are committed to opening up the capital account gradually along a roadmap, with the roadmap itself being recalibrated on a dynamic basis. We need to balance the needs of the macroeconomy with the compulsions of macroeconomic and financial stability. So as we progress towards capital account convertibility, we have to meet certain preconditions. Those preconditions are fiscal consolidation, resilience, greater resilience of our financial sector. Our exports should be more competitive. Our imports should be more price elastic. We should get more FDI with less of a bureaucratic interface and become a more friendly investment destination. So in short, our policy is festina lente, which in Latin means make haste slowly. So as I conclude, I want to say I raised 2 questions. I have 2 more, but for want of time, I will not go into them. As I conclude, my best wishes to the Prime Minister for long life, health and happiness, fulfillment, and every success in leading the nation. I want to thank ICRIER, OUP, Dr. Mrs. Ahluwalia, Sri Manja Khan, for allowing me to speak at this festschrift. It's been an enormous honor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Subbarao. And may I now invite our last speaker, Mr. T N Ninan from Business Standard.
Honorable Prime Minister, my fellow panelists, Isher Ahluwalia, and friends. At the outset, let me add my congratulations to Isher for organizing this event and for getting a battery of distinguished commentators to contribute to what is an outstanding collection of essays and to update them and make the book an Oxford Perennial. The person in whose honor the book has been produced deserves no less. I've been wondering these last few weeks as to why Isher asked me to be up here today. And you may be thinking the same thing. As you know, they say no news is good news, and some will add no journalist is even better. But since I'm up here, I suppose I must use the Prime Minister's presence to say a word about journalism as the government's interlocutor. I recall the time 4 years ago, in early 2008, when Dr. Singh very kindly received the first book brought out by our fledgling books division. Hosting a reception at his residence on the occasion, Dr. Singh gently admonished both Business Standard and me for seeing the glass half empty and for not recognizing that it was also half full. I quote his words, "To say we must do more, as Business Standard always tells us, is unexceptionable and welcome. At the same time, there is no harm in recognizing what we have done." In Dr. Singh's style, it was gently said, and we got the message. But Lyndon Johnson said it more colorfully. He complained once, and I quote, "If I walked on top of the water across the Potomac River, the headline that afternoon would read, 'President can't swim.'" But truth be told, the Prime Minister has a point. As Ashok Gulati, who's here, says in the postscript to his chapter, The fixed investment in agriculture has trebled as a proportion of agricultural GDP. The result is that agricultural growth rates have gone up. Montek has talked about public-private partnership, and I'm not as gung-ho as he is about it because there is a whole risk of crony capitalism. But it's also true that the investment in infrastructure has gone up and in fact doubled, I think, as a percentage of GDP. And once again, we can see the results. The rate of adding new power capacity generation, for instance, has doubled. The approach paper to the 12th plan points out that the number of children in middle school has doubled in the last 5 years. Changes like these are of enormous significance. And I must confess that don't get as much attention in the media as they should. But let me also say that Business Standard did take note of these. I'm afraid, however, that we have continued frequently to be critical of the government, even though it's led by a person whom, like all of you, I deeply admire. In my defense, I can only quote the philosopher Erasmus, who said half a millennium ago that to be a friend is to be in opposition. But even a critically minded journalist can see that change is not easy to bring about, because you now have a truly unique political system. And for whom a truly unique political system, and it is unique because of 4 features. First, we've copied the communists, for whom the party is supreme and the government secondary. This is, of course, alien to the Westminster system, which we nominally follow, and creates some problems, as we've seen, for the people who happen to be in government. Second, we have a prime ministerial system in Delhi, but a de facto presidential system in most of the states. So the Prime Minister at the center has to be consultative in all things, but presidential-style chief ministers in states can be as arbitrary and whimsical as they wish. Third, we have a coalition system at the center where the cabinet acts like the American Confederacy. Each minister is an independent republic. So we have one policy under ex-environment minister who's sitting at the back, and quite the opposite under Y environment minister who's sitting in front. And both are the policies of the same government. The fourth and the final unique feature of our system is that our courts can and do dictate policy, breaching the walls that ensure a separation of powers. But when a former judge of the Supreme Court, whom the government has foisted in the press council, declares that 90% of Indians are foolish, it does raise questions about the percentage of those on the bench who are likewise. And how, if you will allow me to mix metaphors, the physician will heal himself. Anyway, having got ourselves a system that's designed to make functioning difficult, what are the people in government expected to do? Among other things, they have to make an omelette without breaking the egg. Now, this is something that even a Michelin chef cannot conjure up. But we expect our government to introduce organized retail chains without anyone in any kirana shop being worse off. This demand for Pareto optimality, where no one can be better off if someone else gets worse off, denies us massive potential benefits at the cost of relatively small potential losses. But our political system is such that no losses seem tolerable. A car project that can transform the industrial map of a state and create thousands of jobs is seen as worth sacrificing in the name of giving land back to 400 farmers. They call this poribartan. I think it leaves us with an empty bartan, which also makes a lot of noise. I wonder what would have happened if he'd said back in 1983 that the Maruti project would not be allowed if any worker in any existing car factory were to lose his job. But that's the situation we have today. But even in this political environment that we've created, is there a wiggle room for bringing about any kind of economic reform? In the presence of Dr. Singh, it will be impertinent on my part to suggest any kind of answers, but that's the privilege of a journalist, so I'm going to suggest some guidelines. First, we must learn from homeopathy and the importance of small doses. I think Raghu said just now that we must immediately get petroleum product prices back up to some kind of reasonable level, and I would say the exact opposite. I would suggest that we learn from Gujarat, which I'm told raises its power tariff by 2% every quarter. No one notices, and no one protests. It seems to me that we can do that for petroleum pricing and for pricing reform in general. Second, we have to find a way to get beyond positions adopted either out of fear of change, which can be natural, or because of ideological bias. As the Chinese would say, we must feel the stones as we cross the river. For instance, there is this whole debate about cash transfers and food security bill. And like all such debates, is dialogue with the deaf. But if we were to introduce income transfers through pilot projects, and then do state-level changes that demonstrate that a lot of money does indeed get saved, as I'm told Andhra Pradesh has done, and only then commit to a national rollout, it's hard to sustain ideology-driven opposition when the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Third, since politicians and civil society leaders do not like being told that poverty is declining, we must assure them, as Jesus said, that the poor will always be with us. How do we do that? By making poverty a relative and not an absolute definition, which is to say that you're poor if your family gets less than 60% of the income of a median family. And please note I say family, not individual. And that's a European definition. This means 2 or 3 things. One, there will always be a large number of poor people. So no one can be afraid that poverty is disappearing. 2, the number of people will always, poor people will always be less than 50% of the population, because that's the definition. You have to be 60% of the median, which is half. So any anti-poverty programs or fiscal transfers will, by definition, be aimed at the really poor. And 3, this will actually also help track inequality, because a skewed income distribution pattern will mean that a larger number fall within the 60% category. That's 3 goals in one, and none against. Finally, reform has not yet got a political constituency, even after 21 years, because we talk of the fiscal deficit, we talk of tariff walls, we talk of public debt, we talk of monetary policy, we talk of arcane things that don't mean anything to ordinary people. I would suggest that the market for change will exist and grow only if it is linked to the market for votes. Instead of power sector reform, why not talk about guaranteed electricity supply, for instance, and at lower cost if possible? These are just by way of example, and I can suggest several more, but my time will run out. But I do want to suggest that change is in fact possible. And that brings me to my final point about the business of inclusion and how we may have got it all wrong. True inclusion happens when you create jobs, and you do that when you facilitate low-cost manufacture in labor-intensive industries. We have failed to do that. So in China, which is getting into higher middle-income category, negates low-cost manufacture, the factories go to Vietnam and to Bangladesh, not to India. But we don't point that out in our public debates. And we don't want to discuss labor policy or the cost of infrastructure that prices out manufacturing. Surely make-work programs in the name of inclusion are not a substitute for creating real work, which is also growth-enhancing. If people have decent-paying jobs, that also provides food security. So how about making jobs the centerpiece of the inclusion debate? My overall point would be, in an atmosphere of declining optimism and a sense of stasis, the change is possible, and we can and must bring it about. In closing, let me recall the lines that George Bernard Shaw wrote 90 years ago, and which have been quoted often since. Quote, "You see things and you say, why? But I dream things that never were, and I say, why not?" It is a quotation that used to hang up on the wall of the newsroom in India Today when I worked there 30 years ago. May I suggest that it's the job of all of us to ask both those questions, why and why not? Thank you.
Thank you, Ninan. I'm afraid we have taken longer than we had thought in the initial stage, but we have time. So I would request the audience to maybe be very brief, and we'll take 5 questions from the floor for the panelists. So please raise your hands, those who want to ask. Dr. Paipanandikar.
Only one question about what Ninan said. How and why? With 32% savings rate, how do we manage a 6% growth rate?
Okay, I think I'm going to collect the questions and then turn to the panelists. So if there is... Can I? Yes, NK?
This is a question to Raghu. Raghu, I think that you had a fairly daunting, even a short-term agenda. And since governments must first survive before they can reform, which is axiomatic almost, if you had to reprioritize that, what are, in your short term, the core components of that short term, which you believe is central to macroeconomic stability, what would you say?
Thank you. Do I see any hands at the back? Well, if not, then may I turn first to Ninan, the question from Dr. Paipanandikar, and then Raghu to the question from NK.
Oh, everybody here on this panel is more qualified than I am to answer that, but there is no one-to-one relationship in any particular year between the rate of savings and investment and growth. That's a medium to long-term correlation that you get. So you can have cyclical factors coming in the way of structural rates. So, I think Kaushik, who's sitting here, put the figures in his last economic survey last year when he said 9% growth because the investment rate is 36%. And that's the sort of short-term correlation that I think is dangerous to make.
Well, I mean, as you said, you want the minimum list which will do what you need to do. Clearly, bringing confidence in the international investor is quite important because the negative effects could spiral out with effects on the exchange rate and so on. And I think one way of bringing confidence is to say, look, we're serious about bringing down the fiscal deficit and we won't expose that fiscal deficit to fluctuations in international oil prices, which I think, there are people who say they are going to come down, but there are other people who are worried about the geopolitical problems in the Middle East and whether, an attack by Israel, God forbid, on Iran could make those prices go to 150, 170. We need to insulate against that. That is why, I said oil prices, bringing our diesel prices, bringing our fuel prices back to international levels will give confidence that they will adjust if, in fact, those prices go very high. And that will eliminate one source of concern that the international investor may have, and also help bring down the fiscal deficit and the corollary effects. So if there's one thing I would pick, one thing to spend political capital on, let's try and convince the political parties the time has come. Don't make noise about this. This is something we need to do. But of course, the realities are that sometimes people don't listen to reason. I do fear that we are getting close to the point that there may be stress. I agree with Dr. Subbarao that not necessarily the same situation as 91, but there will be significant stress if oil prices go out of.
Okay. Honorable Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, Dr. Subbarao, T N Ninan, Professor Raghuram Rajan, Isher Ahluwalia, and everyone in this august gathering. It is a great honor and privilege for me to, as the publisher of this prestigious volume, to be here firstly, standing here, and to propose a vote of thanks at this evening's program. Isher did mention in her introduction, the beginnings of this volume go back to 1997, when Isher asked me if OUP would publish a festschrift to honor Dr. Manmohan Singh on his 65th birthday. I was delighted at this opportunity of associating Oxford University Press with this project to honor India's most distinguished economist and statesman, and that too by India's leading economist and policy makers as contributors to this volume. I'm delighted to see that so many contributors of this volume are present here today. I'm even more delighted because most of them are independently authors of OUP. Before moving on, I would like to tell you that thousands, I don't want to give out the number of volumes sold because of the Prime Minister's presence. I'd like to tell you that thousands have benefited by reading this volume in the last 13 years. Earlier this year, it was my turn to phone Isher to propose that we would like to include the festschrift for Dr Manmohan Singh in OUP's new centenary series, Oxford India Perennials, being launched to celebrate OUP India's 100 years in 2012. Oxford India Perennials, for your information, is a series representing classic works of enduring value from a century of OUP's publishing in India. And OUP has published many great minds over these years. I think the first 4, as Isher alluded to, have already been published. And there is a selection process that's already on, which will bring out volumes as time goes on. And these volumes are being revised with new introductions or postscripts and with new covers. And they will really represent a very strong brand of classic works. And we are delighted that we could publish Dr. Manmohan Singh's festschrift in it. Isher enthusiastically agreed to my proposal, and her ever-efficient persuasive skills worked to get all the contributors except one to provide a postscript, while the editors of the volume, Isher herself and Professor Vigyan Little, wrote a new epilogue for the 2012 edition. It is fitting that such an important work tracing India's economic progress, which began with the reforms of 1991 introduced by Dr. Manmohan Singh when he was the finance minister, and which have led making India the second fastest growing economy in the world today, has been updated to bring it to the latest developments impacting India's economy. I believe this will continue to be of immense value to policymakers, students, and all those interested in the progress of India's economy. I thank the Honourable Prime Minister for his presence here this evening, but very importantly, I'd like to thank him for giving us this very good economic growth through his reforms. I know we've heard the eminent panelists telling us about the impact of reforms, but in my own way, I would like to share as somebody in the educational space the kind of hunger for education that I have seen in the smaller towns of India, across India, is amazing. And that's been led by the economic growth. The economic progress of India has made this hunger come alive, and many more schools are coming up. Everybody wants to go and study, get a good job, and those opportunities exist because of this growth that we've had in the country, introduced by Dr. Manmohan Singh in 1991 and carried on in the later years. I would like to thank Isher, not only as the editor of the volume, but I know as a publisher that being an editor is not an easy job, and especially when you're dealing with eminent people of this kind, to give their contributions, give it on time. It was achieved in the first instance because there was a deadline and we had to publish it at a particular time, but also getting the postscript done in a very short time. So thank you, Isher, for being such a brilliant editor. But also I'd like to thank her for being a great organizer. She's organized this evening, I think, paying tribute to Dr. Manmohan Singh. We've heard the panelists glowing tribute to him, and I'm sure everyone in the audience would share and want to say that. So this is a great evening, and thanks to Isher for organizing this evening. I also thank the distinguished contributors, some of whom are here this evening, for providing the postscript and for their original contributions. I would also like to thank the eminent panelists for their discussion this evening, bringing alive the growth of India's economy and the role of Dr. Manmohan Singh and his reforms. Finally, I would like to thank all of you, this very, very distinguished and august gathering that is here today, and many of you also have, along with Dr. Manmohan Singh, over the years contributed to the progress of India. Thank you very much.
What should you want to do now? Well, I had accepted this invitation on the condition that I will not be asked to speak, and I do not wish to break that. But I would like to thank each one of you for your presence here. I should like to say a special word of thanks to all the contributors to this volume and to our panelists today. They have thrown new lights on old problems. They have mentioned many challenges that our economy faces. There are difficulties, and life would not be worth living if there were no difficulties. But I am confident that with determination, we will overcome.
May I just request everybody to wait till the Prime Minister leaves, and then, as you know, there is dinner in the atrium, so I would really expect all of you to find your way there. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Yes, sir.